Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining me today. It's a pleasure to be with you. Most of you are familiar with my book. The 32nd edition is going to be released next year. But as I was going around the show, and by the way, I must tell you, I get a real sense of emotion when I come in and I see the explosion of brands. I started tracking niche back in the late 80s. And just to see the explosion that's taken place, I almost feel like a grandfather with a huge number of grandchildren out there. It's been amazing. But at one of the stands, I was asked a question. Why do you classify fragrances? The brands classify the fragrances. Why don't you need to do it? And it wasn't a dumb question. It was a very pertinent question. Absolutely right. The brands do classify their fragrances. But the problem is that each brand likes to differentiate its fragrances. And so each brand describes the fragrances differently. What a different company describes, by Kilian, from Dior, by Chanel, might be a floral Oriental. But there are a lot of different ways that it's described to kind of make it more individual, make it more special. Take Dior, for example, their latest fragrance, Poison Girl. The description is a soft floral, so you'd expect it to be light and soft, maybe a touch powdery. Oh no, this is a potent floral Oriental coming through there. True, it is soft by comparison with the original Poison, but there's no way in the world that this is a light little thing that's going to fade away quickly. It's potent. And that's why I work on classifications. My job is to understand what the brands and the perfumers, you brands, the perfumers are talking about. I'm not a dictator. My job is to understand what the brands and perfumers are talking about, and then to put it into a vocabulary that will allow us all to say apples versus apples, comparison versus comparison. You see, the problem is that in addition to the brands with their different description, the perfumers complicate the issue, because every great oil house, Givaudan, Firmenich, Symrise, Fragrance Resources, they all have their individual way of classifying fragrances, their own language. And so the result is a cacophony of confusion out there. My job essentially is to understand what they're talking about and relate it to an apples versus apples comparison so that you can get an idea that this one fragrance, if you like it, that's another fragrance that you should also like or compare it to. My job comes from retail. I'm not a perfumer. Yes, I've become an evaluator, but I came from retail because I was fascinated with the problems that people have in trying to find fragrances that they like. And life has not got easier. You're going to see that last year we tracked over 2,000 new fragrances, so it's even more confusing for people. Remember, if you would, that I grew up with the New World wines when I started working in the 60s, the 70s. That was when the New World wines were coming so strongly. And they were talking a new language. The old language was the language of terroir, the French, the German, the Italian systems, Burgundies, Bordeaux's. But here, the New World wines from America, from South America, from Australia, from South Africa, they talked a language of cultivar. They said, these are Sauvignon Blancs, these, for example, are Rieslings, these, for example, are Shiraz. And we started to understand a little bit better what they were talking about. And that's exactly what I do. I try to get everything into the basic families that the industry agrees with, and then do the comparison so that you can smell an apples versus an apple. The book has now become a reference, and you're probably unaware that, in fact, much of my work, while we make no charge for listing fragrances, we still do, there's no charge for listing fragrances. I don't accept advertising or sponsorship. As a result, we're impartial and independent, and it's probably I'm the only one in the industry who is that way. But we work closely with retailers around the world to develop a number of very sophisticated iPad programs. Here is one, for example, that I'm showing you. This is customized for a retailer, and you can have a lot of fun. You can play around with wheels. You can get recommendations of fragrances there. We work at any one time with about 5 retailers because it's a very intensive effort. In the United Kingdom, we partner with the Perfume Shop. They're the #2 volume seller in the market, and it's been a marvelous partnership for now going on for 4 years. In the Far East, we partner with DFS, the LVMH duty-free one there. We do programs for them, believe it or not, in English, simplified Chinese, traditional Chinese, Korean, and Japanese. In the Middle East, we partner with the Shaloub Group and also with all the distributors in Saudi Arabia to produce sites online there. In America, we partner with the Nordstrom. They've been my retail godfather since 1988 when they picked up a book and said, we like it, we'll use it. And they've been the most marvelous one. It was Nordstrom who got me to add men's fragrances in 91, because before then it was just women's. And it was Nordstrom who in 93 asked me to actually add niche perfumes. They wanted to put a Nicotal into South Coast Plaza outside of San Diego. And so that was really the introduction. I'd been tracking them before then, but that was the first time I approached one of the niche houses and said, can we understand each other? Can we start classifying on that kind of thing there? You're probably unaware, while you're aware of the book, you may not know that all the information we have comes from a vast database. No, it's not a consumer database. It's not available to the perfumistas. It's a business database created primarily for the perfumers. Subscribers to this database would include Firmenich, Givaudan, Symrise, all of those there. Also the great brands. The book comes out once a year, but the database is updated once a week on that. It's got 2 parts to it. There's a research wizard, which allows you to search anything. If you want to have a look at, for example, which fragrances contained mango and pineapple and came out of American companies, click, 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 and the answer is there at that point. It's an amazing research wizard. And then the other one is a fragrance library with over 20,000 fragrances. It's different from Fragrantica. This one is the official information which is used by the industry and by the perfumers. So when you look at a fragrance, for example, I Miss Violet, you'll see the year that it came out with, you'll see the olfactive direction, that's Luke there, the oil house who created it there, the perfumer, the bottle designer, the complete pyramid, we have the stories, we have the high resolution images. Portrait of a Lady would be another example on that, and so would Crystal Oud there. The research wizard that I mentioned allows you to look at a whole menu of choices: gender, year of launch, the country of origin, for example, the family, the note, the subnotes, pyramid or accord. For example, the way that was used, a perfumer in Singapore emailed us to say that he was working on a new shampoo which had a really high note of a scent of mango and pineapple. And he wanted to know, how do I find out what fine fragrances have incorporated mango and pineapple in their pyramid? So we said, well, all you have to do is just go to the pyramid or chord note, say you want fragrances that have got both of those in, click, 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 and 17 came up with that, so it allows the comparison. It's essentially a business database for business people rather than for consumers. But it's from this database that all the information comes that we use for the retail programs. And that's why when we ask you, please, for information, we say, can we have a high-resolution image, or can we have your keynotes? It's not just for being curious, it's for recording in here and then using in retail programs. We completed recently an iPad program for Nick Smart of Agence de Parfum, the niche czar in Australia. And that is customized to include all the niche perfumes, the artisan perfumes that he distributes in the Australian market. And he finds it very useful. If you see him around, do have a word with him on that. And it's from this database that I'm able to extract all the information for you about new fragrances and trends. And in a few minutes, I'm going to be sharing the overview of this for you. Firstly, let's have a look at how new fragrances have exploded. Going back 10 years, we were just under 1,000 at that point. You'll notice that the financial crisis, 2008, 1220, 1270, it didn't actually drop back, but it kind of held steady. It grew a little bit in 2010, and obviously there was an after effect of the financial crisis in 2011. Then we start to see some steady growth, and now an explosion coming through. 309 new fragrances we tracked last year. That's 17% more than in 2014. Almost every one of them is a niche fragrance. It is the niche category that is expanding the number of new fragrances coming through. When I break this down by gender, you'll see the impact of Artisan on niche fragrances. Have a look at how the proportion of shared. Back 10 years ago, the female fragrances accounted for 58%, shared for 17%. Have a look now. 46% feminine, 37% shared. Shared is essentially the way to go. So much so that in the 2016 Fragrances of the World book, we've consolidated the feminine and masculine index into one index where the gender, whether it's female, whether it's masculine, or where it's shared, is indicated by color. Shared clearly is going, and we must anticipate that 45–50% of the market within the next 5 years will be classified as shared fragrances on that. Now, when we look at Artisan, you'll see the impact here. From 261 new artistic fragrances back 10 years ago, look at that. 874. And I know you think that that's the Middle East. Yes, the Middle East contributed, but under 100, that's all of you. Everybody's coming up with collections left, right, and center, 1, 2, 3. In some ways, it scares me, because I can't but help feel that we're recreating the problems that the luxury selective brands had 2000, 2005, where because the retailers said, new, I want new, they kept on coming out with new, and there was an explosion of fragrances, and before they'd had time to develop one fragrance, they were running on to the next fragrance. And so we had a generation of little orphans. It is a problem for me, these new fragrances. I love something new, and I understand totally that the retailers are not really understanding. But I wonder if we could also give a thought to how we can come up with something new that will satisfy the retailers and yet at the same time build the brand, because at the end of the day, that's there. In every one of your portfolios, if you've got 10 perfumes, you've probably got 2 that are showing more signs of activity, more signs of opportunity than others. And those are the 2 that I feel you ought to focus on. Rather than come out with a totally new fragrance, have you thought perhaps of using the tactic of flankers? Think of J'adore. J'adore eau de parfum, j'adore eau de toilette, j'adore eau sensuelle, j'adore souffle de parfum, j'adore. Each variations on the basic theme, but pulled together, they continue to push the name j'adore. And I wonder if this is not a tactic that's worthwhile looking here. Now, if you don't like that idea, then let me throw up another idea for you. In the United States, what proportion of men and women do you think don't wear or buy perfume? Give me your thoughts. 20%. 20% in the States don't buy or use. Okay. Any other thoughts? 60%. 80% is pretty accurate. Hate to tell you. The problem is that here we have this explosion of fragrances in a world where the majority of people are ignoring us, because perfume doesn't speak to them. In some of these sophisticated markets, the perception is it's almost antisocial to wear perfume. Partially, that's a result of many of us working in offices very close by jowl with other people on that, and there's ecological things that have come on in. And so, yes, you can focus on the flanker tactic, but have you ever thought of stepping back and saying, okay, I have a fragrance, I have a name. How can I put this together in other ways that will intrigue people who don't wear perfume, new consumers? For example, I used to be a runner, but I'm getting old. I had a sprain, and now I'm crippled with osteoarthritis. But imagine I was a runner. Why can't you give me a shirt, a running shirt, which not only helps the perspiration, not only activates me, but with a slight scent makes me feel more active? Silly, I know. Why can't I have a blanket that I can take on a plane that will not only keep me warm, but that slight scent is very relaxing? Or when I'm focusing on an assignment and I need to concentrate, just as we have rescue remedies for when you're stressed, why can't you give me something for that? Now, there's no logical reason why you can't link that to your scent. It may be just a part of your scent. It may be some of the molecules, some of the notes in it which you've then pushed. But in effect, what you're doing is that you're taking the strength of your basic sense and you're looking for new usage, which for me is an opportunity. You are all creative. I mean, the niche market has exploded since I first started tracking it, and it's exploded because of your creativity. I throw down the challenge. What can you do for the future? What new things can you do? I mean, the reason I love the niche is because the main fragrance market has been hijacked. Number one, in the 80s, they were hijacked by American department stores who on-sold their products to discounters. Then in 91, they were hijacked when the Gulf War started. By that time, these great brands were in the hands of the great multinationals, and whether you like it or not, a budget is a budget is a budget. So they resorted also to the diversion tactics. But ever since then, I know you don't have much pity for the great brands, but have you thought what a tough life it is for them? Because if they don't make the quarterly estimate they gave the stock exchange, their share price gets savaged. And so they're constantly on a treadmill of ensuring that the sales are up and up and up and up and up. And that's why when they go with a new fragrance, they wanted to have the broadest appeal, the safest bet. Trouble is, when you have a fragrance with a broad appeal, you end up often with a fragrance that is nice and very pretty and totally forgettable. So that doesn't help you very much indeed. I love the artisan market because you were the guys that opened up this creative universe. 100 brands, 200 brands. Out of that, maybe 5, 6, 7 open up a new creative direction. Think of what Byredo did. Think of what Frederic Malle did in addition to Parfum. What about Le Labo? All of these are a new direction. My challenge to you is, what new directions can you now think of? You've got yourself, I think, locked in a little box. New fragrance, new fragrance, new fragrance, new fragrance. And I understand. But when you look at that figure, that's a tough thing to be able to kick around in the future on that. Now, I'm going to break this down a little bit more for you. We segment in the database artisan fragrances into 5 categories here. First of all, Haute Parfumerie. What do I mean by that? Okay, these are the great houses that have their own in-house perfumer. Think of Guerlain, for example. Think, for example, of Hermès's Hermèscence, Jean-Claude Elena, or Les Exclusifs from Chanel, Jacques Polge, Olivier Polge. Think, if you would, of Cartier, Mathilde Laurent, with Les Heures de Parfum. So these are the great houses with their own in-house perfumery. No, Givenchy would not be there because the Givenchy L'Atelier, they use outside perfumers. This would be the second category, the creators. Here you would have Serge Lutens. His creator, his genius is Chris Sheldrake in that one. That's where you would have Byredo. Ben Gorham is the creative director, the visionary behind Byredo, but it's Jerome Epinet of Robertet, the perfumer with whom he works. This would be the different company. With Luc Gabriel, all his fragrances, he directs a number of different perfumers. So here I'm looking at houses that have a visionary, a creative direction there, and use outside perfumers for them. Then we look at the perfumers. It's been really interesting to see the development of how perfumers are coming in from 33 to 129. Now, guys, don't take offense. I'm talking real live perfumers. Okay? I'm not talking pretend perfumers. I'm not talking perfumers who 2 years ago were a motor mechanic. I'm talking perfumers who are part of the profession of being a perfumer. In many ways, this is a profession that seems trite today. We hear, a perfumer, I'm a perfumer, yes, this kind of thing. I wish I could give you a feeling for what it actually takes to be a perfumer. There are less than 700 in the world. On average, their training takes longer than a neurosurgeon. The pressure under them is constant. Changes in government regulations force them constantly to modify. They're at the mercy of product managers, marketing managers who have an idea which may be only half-baked, but they have to satisfy that oneself. And at the same time, they have to come up with something that will create an emotion. I wish I could tell you it's easy to create a perfume. I've never created one, but I've watched so many occur. It can take an immediate, or it can take a lifetime to create it. And so often they create a fragrance and it's put out and it doesn't succeed. Can you imagine the disappointment? But one of the intriguing things is to see how the artisan market is attracting real perfumers with some very interesting work. You've already known Patricia de Nicolai, for example, the skier of the Guerlain family who came into perfumery because the Guerlains didn't like the idea of a lady perfumer, so she said, stuff you, I'm going to create my own house on that kind of thing, which I love her for that. But what's interesting now, we're talking about people like Alberto Moraes, the great Firmenich Spanish perfumer, creating his own ones. What about, for example, others that have now come into the market? Think of Rossando Matteo, who for 40 years has been directing the development of all the Puig fragrances, whether it's Nina Ricci, Paco Rabanne, Valentino, all those. Now he's retired and he comes out with his own range. Some interesting stuff coming here. By the way, have you been through to Mark Buxton's stand? Have you seen that the three musketeers, Guy Schoen, Bertrand Dufourcheux, and Mark Buxton have come out with a range under the title Renegades? Because they are renegades, but they're very nice fragrances. You must have a look at those if you haven't already touched on that. So these are the true perfumers. I'm not talking about copycats. I'm talking about true perfumers here. Heritage we look at. Here you're talking about brands like Penhaligon's, Le Gallion, Robert Piquet, Volnay, for example, which have a heritage and are being revitalized. For us in niche, I'm not sure if you know, but everything traces back to Sheila Pickles and Penhaligon's. In 1975, when Sheila Pickles, at the urging of her boss, Zaffarelli, the movie director, bought this little old company and discovered the formula from Mr. Penhaligon and started what was then to be an experiment, and it worked, is Penhaligon's. And finally, the Perfumeries. These would be examples, Edith de Venustus or Min New York, the retailers that are going into perfumery on that kind of one. Looking at the figures, you can see Haute Parfumerie, the great houses, is getting more and more and more. We anticipate that that's probably going to go up to about 40, 45 this next year. The creators are where it's all exploding. Now, part of this is also coming from the extremely high end. I don't know if you've seen Carolina Herrera's collection of 14 fragrances, or Prada's 2 collections there. They total about 20 altogether. So in niche, you are facing significant competition from these great brands, which underlines even more the importance of looking out of the box, creative, something that is unusual. Remember, they're constrained by a management structure that condemns risk. You're not. Now, that's the biggest opportunity I think you've got in a market like this. The perfumers, I anticipate that this is going to be a very interesting trend. More and more of the perfumers are going to want to create their own brands, and that's going to revitalize the integrity of our whole market on that. Heritage fascinates me. The world is in love with nostalgia of yesteryear because they feel it to be authentic. Anticipate that more older brands are going to be revived. Retailers, a mixed bag on that kind of one. At the end of the day, their job is to sell fragrance, not create it. And they often find it a tough job to be able to get into that market that way. Now, when you look at the wheel, we've looked at the numbers. You're familiar with the wheel. For those of you who don't know how it developed, when I started my work for the first 10 years, I trained over 45,000 people around the world. And this wheel evolved because when you're training, you're constantly looking to simplify, simplify, simplify. I had two great mentors that I revered in my working career. One was Guy Robert, who worked with me so hard on Perfume Legends, and for the last 16 years of his life was my technical consultant. The other was Edmund Rudnitzer, the great perfumer who created fragrances such as Femme, Diorissimo, Diorella. These were masterpieces that changed the architecture of perfumery. And I remember once I asked him, Monsieur Rudnitzer, if you had to offer just one piece of advice to anybody, what would you offer? And he gave 3 words: simplify, simplify, simplify. Whatever you do, simplify, simplify, simplify. And it's been a credo of mine ever since. But what we did for you here is that we've taken out the florals, the orientals, the woody, and the fresh to show you the trends that are happening within the market. Here we're looking at the florals. Florals would be ranging from perfumes, for example, such as Happy, to the classics of Joy, all of those bouquets of flowers. Soft florals is my name for the floral aldehydes. As you probably know, my work is used largely at retail, and if you say to a lady at the counter, it's a floral aldehyde, you get a puzzled look back, and so you feel necessary to explain, well, the aldehydes have got a nasty smell and they're synthetic, but they ran magic, and by that time you've lost the plot. At the end of the day, we're talking about fragrances such as number 5, for example, that are soft and powdery at the dry down. So I call this soft floral. Here's the evolution: 29, 28, 28, 28, 27, 27, 25, 27, 28. It's remarkably consistent. Remember, these are the proportions of new fragrances coming into the market. Soft floral, 677, 667, 664. It's a category which I think is wide open for reinvention. There's been not that much happening in it there. Put the two together and you see that florals are accounting for about 1/3 of the market. What about the orientals? Aha, 29 up to a peak now of 32. The orientals, the true ones here, you're talking about Shalimar, Prada Candy, ones like that. Not a major influence in development. The soft orientals, this is the category of Youth Dew and Opium. Old Spice for men. For me, this is a category way overdue for development. Reinvent Opium with a new twist to it for this generation. Reinvent Youth Dew. I wish Tom Ford, for example, would take Old Spice and reinvent it. I think it would be I'm not kidding you, I think it would be really interesting, because if you look at his fragrances, he's going through all the great classics of the 60s and the 70s and reinventing them there. Italian Cypress is Holston Z14, for example, that I worked on in 1976. I wonder what he would do in Old Spice. Okay, question, I wonder what you would do in Old Spice. Look at the past, don't ignore it, and just say, wow, if I were to reinterpret this with a twist like this, what might the opportunity be? You don't always have to reinvent the wheel on this kind of thing. Floral orientals, remember in my classification, floral orientals are floral orientals, dominated usually by orange flower. The classics there would be Le Bleu of 1912, Oscar de la Renta of 1977 coming through there. But then I also break down floral orientals into floral and woody orientals. I had to do this because in 1985, Givenchy introduced Isatis. Ah, said the perfumer, c'est un chypre. No, said Givenchy, it's an oriental. Then, the year later, came Passion by Elizabeth Taylor. Ah, said the perfumer, c'est un autre chypre. No, 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 said Elizabeth Arden, Elizabeth Taylor. It's an oriental. They were both right. What we were seeing was the evolution of a new subfamily of Orientals fused with the potent wood notes of patchouli and sandalwood. And I have to keep friends with all of you in the Perfumers. So my only solution was to create a new family called the Woody Orientals. And now the industry has followed. So when you look at mine, remember the floral Orientals are dominated by orange flower, florals. The Woody Orientals are probably dominated by the potent wood notes of sandalwood and patchouli in that. This is where there's been huge development since the launch of Angel in 1992. It's also, of course, where so many of the ouds are coming in, which explains why you're seeing the 12, 14, 15% coming down the track. All in all, Orientals are probably one of the key opportunities to continue to look at. Now the woods. When I was a kid product manager, we had the axiom that woods were tough to sell. That if you came out with a chypre or a woody note, you had to be prepared to lie low and let it develop for at least a year. No longer. Brands like Aromatics Elixir, Romance opened up a new, more wearable interpretation of that. With the elimination of oak moss in chypre and the patchouli's note, it's becoming a lot more accessible. Think of Narcisca Rodriguez, for example, on that one. And the result is showing, look at the total, from 17 to 22%. That's near a 20% increase over that 10-year period. The woods themselves, 9 to 14. We put that down largely to one fragrance, 92, Féminité du Bois, Serge Lutin's masterpiece there, created by Chris Sheldrake and Pierre Baudin. It was never a commercial success, but it enchanted the perfumers. And so many interpretations have come down of that particular note. The mossy woods themselves are finding it hard to gather a new audience because oak moss is no longer available for their use. And somehow, even the patchouli notes, beautiful as they are, have not really exploded that category. Woods are where it's at there. Dry woods are my description for the leathers. I use that because originally when I worked with Nordstrom on this classification, we found that in America, if you talk about leathers, people think of shoes. And they preferred something that was not quite as overtly aromatic as shoes. So we call dry woods. But if you think of this as leathers, that's it. It's interesting. It just continues going. And especially among niche. Look at Naomi Goodsir. She's just in love with leathers. Leathers are a key development in that. Finally, the fresh notes. Oh, wow. They really have changed. Citrus. Pretty constant over the years. Water, which started in 1990 with New West for her and then Escape in 91, it remains a very minor category. Much of that is taken up with Acqua di Gio, the #1 men's fragrance around the world. Green notes are a non-starter. So please be very careful if you come in with a green note. Don't anticipate that it's going to develop much. But there's no problem in taking your key fragrances and adding a touch of green to get a little spirit for summer, perhaps. That's where I would use that as an accent. Fruity notes, well, they're kids' fragrances. It's Bath & Body Works who developed that in the United States. And fruity, fruity, fruity. The only major brand that's majored on that is Escada, of course. With their summer fragrances, fruity to an extreme on that. Is there a way that we can make it more sophisticated? It's tough. But it's interesting for you to look at and see what might happen in that. The fougères. This used to be the powerhouse of masculinity. Remember, the name came 1882, Fougère Royale by Paul Parquet, by Aubigon at that particular time there. And then Jicky came in 1889, probably the most modern of all the fougères. But it was Brut in 1964 that changed the whole world. And I know, looking at your expression, when I mentioned the name Brut, there was a sour look on your face. You ought to go down and bend a knee and thank the world for Brut, because it was Brut who opened up the men's market. I'm serious. Brut was the one who came out in '76 from Fabergé, and I know to you Fabergé is a tiny mass company, but when I was a kid product manager, we just died with envy at the money that Fabergé had in packaging their products. Xanadu, Kiku, they put fake fur around tigress and stuff like this. They knew their fragrance business. And when Brut came out, they'd copied a fragrance from France, which was working in America, called Canoe or Canoe there, but they made it better. I'm talking about the original Brut. I'm not talking about the travesty of Brut 33. That was a horror, but the original Brut. But you ask why Brut worked, it was a simple thing. There was a copywriter in America at their ad agency. None of us know who he was. But remember, this was an age where for men to wear fragrance, other men might have thought they were gay. And back at that time, men were petrified about what other men would think of them. And this anonymous copywriter came up with a line that changed the whole world of masculinity. The line for Brut was, if you've got any doubts about yourself, wear something else. He turned fragrance into a statement of confidence and built the men's market. Aramis came 85, a year later in 1965. It failed and then was relaunched under the Aramis Master Plan 68, and it worked. But it was Brut that changed that. Brut was the classic fougère. Then in 1976 came Paco pour Homme, still a major fragrance. 1978 came Azaro pour Homme, still within the top 10 among the world there. Drac en Noir, think of 1981. Drac en Noir took the dihydromercenol, the fresh note, and for the first time we saw a masculine fragrance that started fresh and ended fresh. Cool Water exploded that in 1988 with an overdose of dihydromercenol coming down the track there. Today we're reaping the benefit, but funnily enough, the fougère has gone quite tame. It's an opportunity for you because I think it's worthwhile going back and looking at some of those fougères. They really are both masculine and feminine, and with a new direction it can work very well on that there. In total then, we're talking from 19 to 15% of the market. If I summarize it in these charts, and these will all be available for you online, so you can pick them up at your leisure, you can see the Florals still the dominant category with 31, matching now Orientals slightly overtaking it there. Wood notes at 22, fresh at 15. I put these up because to me, it makes no sense to focus all your fragrance development in one of those key families. You need to balance your business to be able to maximize the opportunity on that. The book will be released next year, and for those of you who are familiar with it, there will be some new changes. There's some 2,000 new fragrances added, but we're changing the format inside. The pictures are beautiful as usual. This is some original photography by Gary Heens and Saskia, who did a book for us 2 years ago on that one. And you can see their illustration of the keynotes within the families there. Big change. Instead of 3 columns for each page, we've moved it to 2 to make it more readable. This is the index. I mentioned we've combined the index, masculine and feminine, into one consolidated index, alphabetical, listed, indicated by color for gender on that. We've taken discontinued fragrances out of the family pages, and out of the 4,000 in our database, we've made a selection of the 1,500 most commonly asked for at the counter and put them at the back of the index. Alphabetical, the name, the brand, the year it came out, and the classification, so that if somebody likes, for example, Quadrille by Balenciaga, long gone, they're able to see that it was an aldehyldic fragrance, soft floral, and they'll be able to look it up in the index there. As I mentioned, the book will be available from April. Please feel free to order it online, and we'd be delighted to continue to work with you. On behalf of my team, 4 of us are here. There's so many of you to get around. Thank you for all your kindness to us. We so appreciate it. A bad girl has just put up her hand for a question.
Yes. Thank you, Michael. I have a question. Do I need a mic?
I don't. Would you be kind enough to offer?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Hi. Yes. I was very interested that was it in 1991 that Nordstrom told you to add the niche
No,
fragrances?
men's. 1993.
1993.
Nordstrom took a book of mine, found the book in 88.
Yes.
91, they asked if I could add men's fragrances.
men's. And
93, they asked if I could add niche perfumes.
Okay. What were the niche fragrances that you gave them, that you told them these are the ones to add? What were the names of those niche fragrances that you were talking about in
that's easy.
1993?
Well, it was...
Because we got so many now. Let's hear the
No,
first ones.
it was l'Artisan Parfumer and Unique Goutal. No, I'm speaking here. Remember, if you would, that if you go back, the evolution of niche is...
two?
No, just at that time, just two. 1975 was Penhaligon's. Penhaligon's was really not available in the States in any great source. Diptyque came along, but for many years, Diptyque was an ambiance house. It took L'Ombre Don L'Eau as their first great fragrance to tiptoe into the real perfume market. Then came Jean-François Laporte, 1978, with l'Artisan Parfumer. So that was one there. I went to see the l'Artisan Parfumer people on that and classified their fragrances. And Unique Goutal was 1980. Then came Serge Lutens. Etro was the first Italian one, 1989, and then came Serge Lutens, 1992. So it was early days just at that time, though.
And right after that, who were the what? It's so interesting because
Oh,
everybody
wow.
claims
You're
they were the early. Because we're niche here. I think we want to know our history, and it's sometimes very badly presented.
Really?
Yeah, people don't know who are.
So if I give you for the site a list of, let's say, the niche fragrances year by year
21st
until 2000, would that help?
Yes.
Yes, with pleasure. We've got a slide. I just didn't bring it. I
Yeah,
don't
because
think.
I think that,
Certainly.
Yeah, because it's exploded, but I think people
did.
want to see
It
who was
did.
out there first, really taking the knocks.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, if you wonder who was taking the knocks, if you wonder who was taking the knocks, remember, if you would, we're all here by accident. I know you don't want to know that, but it's true. When Jean-François Laporte started l'Artisan, when Unique Goutal tiptoed out into the fields with Unique Goutal, these were tiny brands. They were in Paris. About the only people who knew of them were connoisseurs. This was before perfumistas were invented. The journalists from Vogue and people like that there. It took a quirk in America to change it. Firstly, the diverted fragrances. I was telling you that in the 80s, diversion became standard, and then the Gulf War exploded that. The problem for great American department stores, take Nordstrom. Nordstrom had the philosophy that you could take anything back to Nordstrom and they'll give you full price, no questions asked. And so imagine what happens when opium became diverted. You and I could go into a discount store, buy it for $32, go to Nordstrom and say, please, can I have $48? They had to discontinue it. They had to delete it. What do they replace it by? At the same time, we had a generation of women in America who'd grown up in Charlie. Remember, if you would, Charlie was the catalyst that changed perfume. Between the 60s and the 70s, women in America and the Western world were moving from homemakers to the office. Perfume then was a gift. Men gave women a gift. Women wore it, usually on special occasions, high days and holidays, and when they went out. Charlie changed that. They spoke to a generation, Cosmopolitan magazine christened them the cosmonauts. They had money, and they were looking to spend money. And by the end of the 70s, they were spending more money on perfume than men were spending on giving it to them. Remember, if you would, 73 was Charlie, then came Halston, 75, Chloe, the original, in 75, came Oscar de la Renta, 77, Opium, our first blockbuster, the equivalent of Jaws in the movies, an explosion. So when I started at the end of the 70s, life was different at that stage. So we had all these fragrances being diverted. But what about the women? They'd grown up in the 70s with Charlie. They'd loved the explosion of American designer fragrances in the 80s. By the 90s, they were ready for something different. They were looking for fragrances that their friends didn't know about. So here we had a unique opportunity. It'll never happen again. Number one, you had department stores and perfumeries who desperately needed new brands to replace the brands that had been into diversion that they couldn't keep anymore. Number two, you had a generation of women, probably 30s, 40s, in America, who were looking for new perfume experiences. Number three, you had all these lovely little geese that nobody knew about in Paris. That's how the niche market developed, and all it needed was one thing to set it on fire: the internet and the perfumistas, and that's what happened. And you, my children, are the result.
Michael, I've got a question.
Yes.
What advice would you give a niche brand, and what would you do to help a niche brand in this sea of many?
Oh, what a lovely question. Let me see. Okay. It's tough. When I was writing Perfume Legends, I asked a designer the question, what's your job? And I've never forgotten his answer. He said, my job is to turn the ordinary into something so extraordinary that you dribble with desire. Number one, you've got to make us dribble with desire. I know it's tough, but until you do, the world's not going to come beating at your door. Every new great thing comes along because somebody has said, wow, I want it. It's hot. That's number one. Number two, be honest. Artisan means honesty, and this is what Sylvia has spoken about so often. You must be honest with yourself, you must be honest with your staff, you must be honest with your collaborators. Please don't try to be a perfumer if you're not a perfumer. You are already a visionary if you're at the head of a company. That in itself is an extraordinary achievement. Your job is to select the fragrances, work with your perfumers. My preference is that you work with one perfumer because I think then you develop a relationship with that. But it's entirely up to you to do it. But I believe that you must acknowledge your collaborators. It's crucial. My team get every bit of recognition that I do because without them I couldn't create. Likewise, your perfumer. You would not like to create in confidence, be anonymous. Where's the incentive? Especially when you're creating for fairly small sales on that. So be honest in that. The third thing is, and this is also picking up Sylvia's comment in many occasions, be coherent. Go and have a look at a Artisan boutique. Go and have a look at a Penhaligon shop. Go look at a Byredo boutique. Go look at an Edition de Parfum. Go look at Le Labo. And I deliberately mean go and look at how coherent they are, that everything from the packaging to the look to the thing is integrated. I would recommend that each brand establishes at least one boutique. It is your test center. It's where you play around to get the actual mix of what the whole thing is all about. It's only in the boutique that you start picking up where this is not quite meshing. There's something not pulling together. And it's no coincidence that all the brands that have been acquired by Estee Lauder, by the companies, by Puig, have got a boutique. Because it's easy then. So if you want to make a lot of money, get a boutique, please, and maybe Estee Lauder will come and beg in at your door. I wish you on that. Does that answer, in essence, the kind of thing? Thank you. You were asking a question, weren't you?
Well, I'm going back to the history of fragrance, say, between 1920s and 1970s.
Yep.
As you mentioned, people turned their nose up when you said brute. And as history, my point is, does history repeat itself? Because, okay, nowadays we have multi-corporations and companies, multi-brands under their umbrellas, beholden to Wall Street. But between 1920s, let's say at least the 40s to 70s, the original fragrances, L'Air du Temps, Shalimar, Femme, Quadrille, they were all individual perfume houses with individual staffs who their own staffs went on the road to stores and brought testers and trained the people behind the counters. Weren't all of these people the original niche perfumers?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And let me give you another example. What's been the most successful niche fragrance ever launched, in your view?
Chanel No. 5?
No, that was before niche was really up there. Oscar de la Renta wasn't niche, really.
But how are you differentiating niche from a
Okay,
L'Air du Temps or Chanel No. 5?
niche for me is a number of categories. Firstly, marketing categorizes the great brands. I work with Pierre Dinon, the great bottle designer, who did Opium, Obsession, Paco Rabanne, all of those great ones. He's in his 80s, still working a lot, still with new bottles out there. And I once said to him, what for you makes a successful fragrance? And he looked at me and he said, you remember those one-armed bandits that you used to find in the casinos? He said, you remember that when you were lucky, you pulled the band and you got 5 cherries and a lot of money came out? I said, yes. He said, well, cherry number 1, the scent. If it isn't going to catch you, if it isn't different, As Maurice Roget of Dior once said, it's just business. It's got to grab people. Even before it's launched, it must already be a myth. Number one, the scent. Number two, the bottle. Naturally, he's a bottle designer. For him, he called the bottle the perfume's little house. It captures everything in that. Number three, the name. He said it is the name that is the opportunity. It must tell the story. And that's why when I come across something which says eau de femme 1, you've got to say, come on, what's the story behind that? There's no emotion in that. Number four, the full story. Maurice Roget, the man who reorchestrated Dior in the 80s, put it best. He said, long before a fragrance is launched, it must already be a myth. It must chart new territory. If people are not talking about it, and this is the key, if people are not talking about it, it's just business. Your challenge is to create a story that so intrigues people that you will get word of mouth, because word of mouth is worth more than all the advertising you can afford. It is word of mouth that is the key on this one. Now, what's the difference between that and niche? Okay, niche for me is an individual experience. I use the word experience because these are creators who offered to share their vision, their experience for you. That's why, unlike the great brands, each bottle is the same. It enhances the sense of experience. And it was Jean-François Laporte who started this idea, and that's why all of you use the same bottle. It enhances the experience of the scent. Number three, you must not test the fragrances. We're not looking for market testing. We're not looking for ordinary fragrances. We're looking for some avant-garde experience. Now, when I go around and I talk to a niche man and he says, we found that we don't have enough masculine users, so we're introducing a male fragrance, I think, he's into marketing. That ain't going to work. Don't do marketing, please. You are your best marketeer. You're coming up as an artist with a new experience. You're going to take a risk on it. And the more risks you take, the more failures you'll get, but the more successes. You'll have a chance at that kind of thing there. This is niche. Niche is an experience. The great brands are marketing. But there is one fragrance, when I ask the question, what's the greatest niche ever? And it's going to shock you. Giorgio Beverly Hills. It started out in one store. It's sold only by putting a scented card into magazines, built up sales of some $4 million. And then the United States Post Office said that if you want to keep sticking these cards into magazines, we're going to charge you a premium. You've got to find a way to seal the sampler into the magazine. And David Horner and Jim Roth, the two people there, that's how they latched onto the scent strip sampler. And then by chance, they thought, why don't we go into a department store? And Fred Hayman ran a friend. He thought it was a friend. He was the chairman of Saks. And the silly guy never returned Fred's call. And by chance, the Bloomingdale's public relations VP was in town. And she came into the store. And Bloomingdale's was planning an Italian promotion in 1984. And so they invited Giorgio to join them. And the rest was history. Giorgio went from 0 sales in Bloomingdale's in 84 to by 1988, there were over $32 million in that kind of one. Their sampling campaign had gone from nothing to a peak of over $100 million, and they sold the brand to Avon for $122 million. Now that's development of a niche. All of you are looking for one fragrance to explode. That's your purpose. One fragrance out of your collection will explode. Then you create a diffusion line based on that with maybe a more accessible price. Then you get into marketing. But until then, take risks. You're not in the business of playing it safe. Leave that for the great brands. Does that answer the question?
Yes, but I think the unknown or anonymous perfumers way back really created their brands for individual houses were niche.
Yeah, but I think we have to look at what happened. If you're talking about between, say, 1910 with Paul Poirot until the First World War, Perfume was a very tiny market. It was the market of connoisseurs, of ladies.
And travelers.
To travelers. But travelers only started, in fact, the first duty-free fragrance was a Cabochard one that came out about that time. That was in the early 50s when travel came about. But this was a very tiny market. L'air du Temps, after the Second World War, brands like L'air du Temps, for example, opened up what we would call the market of the bourgeoisie. It was an easier kind of fragrance to absorb there, and then that went right the way through till the left bank exploded in the 1960s with affordable fragrance. We're now talking of an age which has got to extreme. I mean, this is mass market. One question, then we have it.
Firstly, Michael, thank you so much for your talk.
Oh, it's a
it was a
pleasure.
really engaging performance. Thank you very much. So I thought it was really fascinating when you suggested that niche brands look for new strategies to market juice. This isn't just a new release.
Agreed.
So you suggested perhaps flankers. But I think that's interesting because a lot of people in niche see flankers as the touchstone, soulless, commercial strategy of mass market corporations.
Agreed.
So I wanted to ask you more on that. Are you advocating the strategy of flanker for niche?
Now, let's see. A flanker, by definition, is you come up with an original. I'm going to use a mass market fragrance, Ralph, by Ralph Lauren. It came on out. Then they added the same bottle, the same name, but they added a description to it, Ralph Rocks, Ralph Cool. I don't believe in that. But go to a Dior counter and have a look at how Dior has massaged the J'adore. The same name, they've kept it all, but they've added different descriptions. Eau florale, eau de toilette, eau de parfum, parfum de souffle, which is a softer interpretation and doesn't seem to differentiate the fragrance totally. The usual stuff for flankers is that the new fragrance has little resemblance to the old one. Flankers can work. Think, for example, of Drakkar Noir. The original fragrance was Drakkar. It failed. They brought it back, they didn't bring it back, they created a new fragrance, put in a black bottle, called it Drakkar Noir. It succeeded. The classic example is Coco and Coco Mademoiselle. Coco came out in 1985. It worked in Europe. Initially it worked in America. Remember, it was 84 that Lagerfeld had come on. Sorry, 84 was the launch of Coco. 83, Lagerfeld had come on board, but he hadn't yet wrought his magic on the Chanel brand there. Coco came out with great applause. It was the first fragrance after the death of Coco Chanel. And then it got sideswiped by the avalanche of Obsession in 1985. And the poor little orphan almost died. It was in danger of being discontinued in America and parts of Europe. And that's why they decided on a flanker, Coco Mademoiselle. It worked. Not only was the juice compatible, but it offered a new interpretation of the cocoa note there. And today, Coco Mademoiselle is the #1 selling Chanel fragrance worldwide. It's past #5. So yes, a flanker can work, but not the Ralph Rocks one, because that's not there. But go to Dior and just have a look and just absorb the lesson. Most of the brands have already done the training for you and teaching. Yeah. Guys, thank you so much for your kindness. I'm sorry, buddy. Yes, Andrew.
Just on behalf of all of those, maybe there are very few in this room who are actually around 70 on the work in this industry. We had the good fortune to work on all the name brands that you mentioned, from Drakkar Noir to all of the others. It's wonderful to be acknowledged that. It's wonderful to be acknowledged that we were able to be there at the time of all these founding fragrances and working on them.
I know.
I mean, that's the passion. And maybe people need to learn passion about their products rather more than this is a marketing tool, this is a so-and-so, this is whatever.
Certainly, I agree.
Which is what you've always said.
You have passion here. That's the one advantage you have.
It's
Go
necessary.
let it loose.
And word of mouth.
Exactly.
And the two together make it work.
Exactly. Go let it loose. Thank you again.